Careful. Oh, no. We have Joey Thurgood and Nathan Milana. Sorry, I probably said that wrong. I apologize. You can correct me, Nathan, to present. They are with DHHS, and they are going to be presenting on improving connectedness. We are, like I said, very excited to have them. Sorry, I was just pulling up their bios. My phone doesn't want to connect. There we go. And you guys should be able to, Joey and Nathan, to share your screen from your end, unless you want us to pull it up on ours. Oh, you're good, Joey. Okay, perfect. Well, I will turn the time over to them. If you guys want to introduce yourselves a little bit, that would be great. And we'll turn it over to you guys, and we'll go from there.
Hello, good afternoon. Quickly introduce myself. I am Nathan Malin. I am an epidemiologist and evaluator in the Violence and Injury Prevention Program at the Department of Health and Human Services for the state. I'm accompanied by Joey Thurgood, who is our ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences Prevention Specialist, also in the Violence and Injury Prevention Program. And yeah, we're excited to present to you today. We had the opportunity to present this summer at the Crime Victims Conference, and we were asked to come share again with this group. As we begin, we just wanted to quickly make sure that we knew who was participating. So if you wouldn't mind throwing in the chat what your role is, if you're a social worker, if you're just an advocate from the community, if you're a police officer, or something to kind of give us. Can you go to the next slide, Joey? A little bit of insight into the group that we're presenting to, so that we can kind of tailor our message, hopefully. And also, if you have anything specifically that you're hoping to gain from our presentation, please throw it in the chat, and we will try and make sure that we address those things. All right, so let me look at this. So we got lots of victim advocates, nurses, refugee, DV, sexual abuse. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide, Joey, and we can keep looking at those. But some of the learning objectives that we kind of have for this presentation is to reinforce the importance of the power of connectedness with the latest research and data and Utah-specific data. We hope to promote discussion in ways that social connectedness happens, and the power of connection in overcoming trauma, and how we can improve connection for survivors and for the community. And then also Joey's going to kind of introduce some of the work that we've been doing here in Utah, specifically around connectedness. Next slide. All right. So to begin, I'm going to just kind of get us in the right frame. And I'm going to point to a lot of the great stuff that's been happening recently. Just last month, the World Health Organization came out with a big proclamation, I guess, that they're saying that connectedness is a global issue, loneliness and social isolation that needs to be addressed. In the spring, the United States Surgeon General released an advisory calling attention to the United States epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. And speaking of the Surgeon General, he also released this really great book. I think it's been a year or two now. Time's flying, but if you're interested in the subject at all and want to understand the research and the data behind it, and the medical impacts of health on health of connectedness and loneliness and social isolation, this is one that I definitely recommend. Vic Murthy's Together: The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. And I wanted to start with this quote from that book, where he says that social connection stands out as a largely unrecognized and underappreciated force for addressing many of the critical problems we're dealing with, both as individuals and as a society. Overcoming loneliness and building a more connected future is an urgent mission that we can and must tackle together. And yeah, as social beings, which we all are, connectedness is super important. And I'm going to share with you some of the data and research around that to get you in the right frame again. And then Joey will take over and talk about what we're doing in Utah. So with a quick raise of hands, if you can find the raise of hand tool, who is familiar with adverse childhood experiences research? All right, I'm seeing hands popping up. Looks like we already have a fair amount, depending on how many people are actually back from lunch. Yeah, so the adverse childhood experiences research, the ACEs research, kind of started back in the 90s in California. There were lots of different risk factors that they were kind of looking at in childhood, but over time it was whittled down to 8 or 11 different or childhood adversities that were collected. In Utah, we focus on 8 different childhood adversities in our public health surveys, and we've asked about childhood adversities for many years now on our public health surveys that we do by phone. And it's kind of interesting. We've seen increases recently in the last few years in the numbers of ACEs that people are admitting they have experienced in their lives. And so normally you'd think how the research works, it's a retrospective study. You ask adults about childhood adversity that they have experienced, and you wouldn't expect to see any changes, but we've seen changes, especially over the last couple of years. And kind of interesting, I think maybe people are more willing to talk about the difficult experiences that they've experienced in their childhood. But what the research basically shows is that the more of these different adversities that a person has experienced as a child, the more likely they are to have different health outcomes, negative health outcomes in the future. Important to understand, this does not mean that you're for sure going to have negative health outcomes, but it increases your risk. And so you can see here, someone with 0 ACEs has a very low risk versus somebody with 4+ ACEs has a much higher risk. And if you go to the next slide, Joey, these are some of the outcomes that you're likely to see. On the right side, you have all these different areas. So injury outcomes, mental health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, infectious disease outcomes, chronic disease outcomes, risk behaviors like alcohol or substance abuse, and different opportunities are impacted, like education, occupation, income. And then on the left side, you see this pyramid, and this is kind of showing the progress over time that we see in the research, that a person who has more childhood adversity is more likely to have early death, basically. Again, that is not a certainty, but it increases the risk. And so this is kind of depressing research and something that we've been talking about for decades now. And more people are becoming aware of it because of books like The Body Keeps the Score and others like that. Next slide, please, Joey. Here in Utah, from our public health surveys, we find that around 2/3 of Utah adults have at least one childhood experience of those 8, and then a quarter have 3 or more. And there's disparities in those numbers by sex. Females are more likely than males to have experienced more trauma, as well as differences that we see by different demographic groups. Next slide. Here you can see this is looking at adults, and so we see that adults who say that they had more childhood trauma are more likely to have lower incomes. They're more likely to have disabilities. That could be both something that increases their likelihood to have childhood adversity, as well as an impact of that childhood adversity. And then along the bottom, you see some differences by race and ethnicity and differences by geography in the state. Next slide. And here in Utah, over the last 5 years, we had the pleasure of participating in the CDC grant, the Essentials for Childhood which was focused on creating safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments for children, for all children. And the whole idea of that grant was to look at the environments in which children are growing up and make sure that they have everything in place that makes them less likely to experience childhood adversity, and specifically child maltreatment, abuse, and neglect. And we unfortunately lost funding for that grant, and are not being funded for the next round, the next 5-year round. But we're looking for different data sources or different sources of income to continue the efforts that we started with that grant, because it's really important work. And a lot of public health is moving more in the direction of social determinants of health, which looking at the environments in which people live to make sure that we can improve their health outcomes in the future. Next slide. So again, the ACEs research, the adverse childhood experiences research, is a little bit depressing. But over the last 10 years or so, there's been this new research looking at positive childhood experiences. And what's really amazing about positive childhood experiences is, next slide, Joey, is that this research shows that there are different things that can both mitigate the negative impacts of childhood trauma and prevent childhood trauma, that we can be looking to improve the accessibility in the lives of children. And so this positive childhood experiences questionnaire we included in our 2022 adult public health survey. And we actually have the data now, but I haven't had a chance to look at it, so I can't share it with you yet. But we asked these 7 questions. Before the age of 18, were you able to talk with your family about your feelings? Did you feel that your family stood by you during difficult times? Did you enjoy participating in community traditions? Did you feel a sense of belonging in high school? Did you feel supported by friends? And did you have at least 2 non-parental adults who took a genuine interest in you? And did you feel safe and protected by an adult in the home? And what this positive childhood experiences research is basically showing is that if you have these things, if you have, basically, if you drill these down, it's if you feel connected at home, connected in your school environment, and connected in your community, then independent of your adverse childhood experiences score, you can have good health outcomes or better health outcomes. Next slide, Joey. So yeah, here's some slides. Keep going. And the next one as well. So here, this is just looking at the prevalence of depression and poor mental health in those who have different levels of childhood adversity, is the different colors. So the gold color there is 4 or more adverse childhood experiences in a person's life. And you see, with the prevalence increasing of positive childhood experiences from 0 to 2 to 6 to 7, that the negative poor mental health outcomes and depression decrease significantly from 60% down to 20%. And so even if a child experiences a whole bunch of trauma, adversity in their life, then if they have healthy connections in their home, in their school, and in their community, then they can be resilient and overcome that trauma. Next slide. So yeah, famously, go back, Joey. Famously, Oprah, she had a lot of trauma as a child. And she talked about a teacher that she said saw her. And in the face of all that trauma, she was able to be resilient and have a really successful life going forward. Next slide. And I guess you can skip this. As I mentioned, we have some Utah data for adults looking retrospectively, but it's not quite available to be released to the public yet. But we do have our youth data, and this is really probably what's important, because this is where we can intervene and make sure that these kids have these connections. And so in 2021, we started asking about whether or not kids have a caregiver that they could talk to, a friend they could talk to, and whether or not they felt connected to their school. And here we see we're doing all right. More than 50% of kids have all 3 of those different points of connection. But then we also see that we have around a quarter saying that they don't have those things. And that's a really sad statistic, and we want to make sure that we're addressing those things and helping those kids, especially in that really important developmental time, to have the support that they need to address all the different things that they're dealing with as a kid and growing up. Next slide. Those are the specific questions. And the research. So there's a researcher down at BYU, Julianne Holt-Lundstad, who's known internationally because she talks about loneliness and social isolation. And she did this really landmark study, a meta-analysis looking at all the research that's been done around the world. And what she found basically is that loneliness and social disconnection increases the likelihood of early death. So just like ACEs, just loneliness and social isolation increases a person's chance of early death. Here, combined 29%. But if you look down below that, actual perceived social isolation, you can see that, so there's the objective, subjective piece of this. So whether or not a person feels lonely is the perceived, and then whether or not a person actually is in contact with other people is the 26%. So the most important thing is feeling those feelings of loneliness. And so 32% increase in the likelihood of early death if a person feels like they're lonely. So we need to make sure that we're addressing that. Next slide. So some more questions that we've included in both our adult and youth public health surveys is this social isolation scale, which asks about loneliness and the subjective feeling of feeling left out. So it asks, in the past 7 days, I have felt left out, that people barely know me, isolated from others, and that people are around me but not with me. And for the analysis, I just looked at all 4 of these questions and found the respondents who replied often or always to all 4 of these questions. In looking at the analysis since doing it, I'm and national data looking at adult prevalence. I'm wondering if there's maybe some more nuance that adults put in responding to these, and so they might respond sometimes to one of these and then often always to others. And so the analysis might impact what I'm going to show you next a little bit, but I'm going to work on adjusting that. Next slide. What we found, well, here, a question for the group. So what do you think is the highest risk age group when you think about loneliness and social isolation, or those feelings of loneliness, specifically when we're talking about this data? Feel free to just throw it in the chat, 1 through 8, 6th graders, 11th graders, 10th graders, 12th graders, or adults 18 to 34, adults 35 to 49, adults 50 to 64, or older adults 65 plus. All right, it looks like it's pretty unanimous from everybody responding that it's our older adults who are going to be the ones who are the most likely to indicate that they're lonely. Next slide, please, Joey. So that's kind of what we thought too. I think when we think about loneliness and social isolation, we think about older adults who don't get as much interaction with individuals. But when we talk about feelings of loneliness and that subjective piece, it's really our youth who are the most likely to indicate that they're lonely. So here you can see specifically 10th graders were the most likely to indicate that they were feeling very socially isolated or very lonely. So in 2019, it was 10.7% of youth respondents, all grades. And then compared to adult respondents, it was less than 1% of adult respondents who were categorized as very socially isolated. In 2021, unfortunately, because of the impacts of the climate and culture around COVID, we saw significant increases. And so the rates for those who are very lonely increased for both youth and adults. So from 11%, around 11% to 16% of youth, all ages. And so, yeah, a really kind of frightening thing, especially when we think back about that research from the researcher down at BYU about the impacts of loneliness and how that can decrease longevity, I also didn't talk about the piece in that slide where she talks about it being as bad for your health as smoking 16 cigarettes a day. So if we have 16% of our youth that are feeling lonely most or all of the time, then that is really scary, because that's like we have those youth smoking 16 cigarettes a day, which we definitely would not want them to be doing. Next slide, Joey. And breaking down the specific questions, I just thought it was interesting with both youth and adults. They were most likely to indicate always or often or always to, in the past 7 days, I have often or always felt that people are around me, but not with me. And I just thought that was kind of interesting that yeah, we might have people around us, but if we're not feeling able to share our true feelings and our true selves with those around us, then we may have those feelings of loneliness. Next slide. All right, and so breaking down youth loneliness and some of the groups that are most at risk of feeling that loneliness. We saw our LGBTQ youth, especially trans youth. You can see 45.7% of trans youth compared to 15.5% of non-trans youth in 2021 were categorized as very socially isolated or very lonely. Also, youth who do not have family meals together was a big one. So if families were having meals together, 5 or more, or this is if they were having meals together daily, the youth were only 9.4% of youth that were having family meals together were saying that they felt very socially isolated or very lonely, compared to 33.5% who did not have family meals together daily. So a great intervention point, and I'm working with that professor down at BYU at publishing this research so that we can kind of get that out and help people understand the importance of just getting together and having opportunities where we can talk with our youth about their lives and what's going on. Non-LDS youth were twice as likely as those who considered themselves LDS. Female youth twice as likely as male youth. Non-white youth significantly more likely than white youth. So here's another excerpt from that book. Even as we live with increasing diversity, it's easier than ever to restrict our contact, both online and off, to people who resemble us in appearance, views, and interests. That makes it easy to dismiss people for their beliefs and affiliations when we don't know them as human beings. The result is a spiral of disconnection that contributes to the unraveling of civil society today. So yeah, when you do the analysis of this data, it's the minority groups that are more likely to indicate that they feel very lonely or socially isolated. And so there's really a necessity to try and see through those people's eyes and understand how their lives are and connect with them, especially those youth. With adult data, we also saw that caregivers and our single parents were at risk of identifying as socially isolated. It's a difficult time as you're dealing with all the struggles of being a caregiver, and it's really important to make sure that we're supporting those caregivers and parents. Again, this is from the lens of the work that Joey and I have been doing, focused specifically on youth. But I think a lot of this can be translated to our adult populations as well, and maybe a lot of the people that you're working with that are victims of crime. So we should think about those more minority populations that we work with and make sure that we're helping them to be seen. Next slide. So yeah, just more data about our caregivers. 2.2% indicate that they're not coping well with the daily demands of parenting. That's worse than the national average slightly. Parental help seeking in Utah, 42.1% seldom or never ask for help. And receiving emotional support with parenting, 84.8% said there was someone they could turn to for day-to-day emotional support with parenting or raising their child in the past 12 months. So we're better than the nation, but there's still, you can see 15% of caregivers that don't have someone that they can turn to. Next slide. And I will let Joey take over here, but I will be here at the end if you have any questions about that data or you want to discuss anything more specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit kind of about the approaches that we use to address social connectedness at the different levels that connection takes place, and kind of the foundations for ways that we can increase connectedness across the different levels that connection happens. So social connection and social and community context are super important parts of the protective factor framework. Protective factors are, and I'm sure that I'm kind of, preaching to the choir in this population. I'm sure you're familiar with protective factors and risk factors, but we know that protective factors are things that will make it likely or less likely that people who are experiencing adversity will experience the adversity, or it will increase their resilience when they're faced with the risk factors for adversity. And now I can't get my slides to advance. So kind of in the context of talking about, the population that is being served by the professionals in this virtual space, how does social connection influence or impact the way that, our ability to handle traumatic events or, experiencing crime victimization? And what we find is that a good supportive social network has been shown to buffer risks for negative psychological outcomes. We're seeing reductions in PTSD, depression, and self-harm among individuals who have a good social support system. We see that having a good social having good social connections can actually help the treatment approaches for trauma have more effect. So we're seeing quicker reductions in PTSD symptoms, reduced risk for recurrence of PTSD symptoms, and it can shield against multiple mental health problems that are brought on by experience of trauma. And so let's then talk about the three different dimensions of connection, or where connection happens. And the first place that connection happens, obviously, is in the intimate or emotional dimension. That's where we have our close confidants, where we experience affection and trust, and where we find support. Next, we have the relational level of connection. That's where we take that inner circle and we expand it a little bit wider to include our social circles, the friendships, places where we find companionship and support. And then the final level of connection takes place at the collective or community level. And I think it's important to point out here that the word community does not necessarily, it can mean just geography. It can be the community of Rose Park, or it can be the community of South Salt Lake. But it also can be communities that are defined by sharing beliefs and interests or a shared sense of purpose. And you'll notice here that I put a question mark after support, because I think that where we find we need the most growth to improve social connectedness is at the community level. We know that trauma and crime victimization does not happen in isolation. It happens in the context of community. And what happens at the individual level has impacts on those broader concentric circles across the socio-ecological model. We see when there's social disconnection at the individual level, that is going to impact social connection at the relationship level. If our relationships aren't connected and we don't feel that support, then our communities and broader society are going to kind of suffer due to that individual level of lack of connection, and vice versa. When we have community and societal levels of disconnection where, we lack places and spaces and programs for connection to happen, then that is going to negatively impact connection at the individual and relationship levels. So what do you suppose are some of the root causes of community level social isolation? Let's have you just pop a couple of thoughts into the chat. What do you think would be root causes of why we're seeing social isolation at the community level? Any ideas on that? Oppression. Excellent. Thank you, Eden. Any other thoughts about why we're seeing community level social isolation? Political climate can impact it. Can social norms impact it? Fear. Excellent. All of these really good answers. According to Healthy Places by Design, social isolation is not a personal choice or an individual problem. It's one that is rooted in community design. Do we have spaces and places? It's rooted in our social norms. Do we prioritize social connection within our homes, within our social circles, within our broader communities? And then again, as was mentioned in the chat, kind of the oppression. Systemic injustices definitely figure in to some of the disparities that we see in social connectedness across groups. What we know is that inequity is rooted, or is a root cause and is rooted in social isolation. Too often, our opportunities for social connection and opportunities to break away from social isolation are influenced by where we live, or how much money we make, or the color of our skin. It may even be based upon who we love or what religion we belong to. But if we want to strengthen social connectedness across our communities and within our homes, we have to address the inequities first. That has to come first. So we have to identify where disparity exists and then figure out what the root causes of that disparity are. So how do we go about doing that? How do we kind of encourage community connectedness through that equity lens? And Healthy Places by Design provides us with some really good base recommendations. First, we have to understand the benefit of listening and learning from different cultures and countries and communities, because we have great diversity within our communities. But if those diverse voices are not represented in the leadership and the community voice, then we're going to continue to see that disparity. It's important to recognize, celebrate, and reinforce assets within local communities and social support systems. And that is done by acknowledging that every resident and every neighborhood does have assets and has the ability to lead their own change. And too often, we're not tapping into those assets. Ultimately, we create socially connected communities through abundance thinking. That means that we're focusing on the assets within that community or that population instead of the deficits, and we're strategically leveraging those assets. Okay, so Healthy Places by Design has a kind of a roadmap, and they've created these 5 pillars. And I'm going to show you in just a second the 5 pillars within the Surgeon General's advisory on social isolation and loneliness, and you'll see kind of how they compare. First of all, we have to prioritize connection within our community design. Have we created places and spaces where diverse people can come together and connect within their community group and identity, identity, and outside of that? Are we creating spaces where people who don't look the same or don't think the same are able to come together and connect in a healthy way? Next, we have to invest in programs that bring people together. So first we create spaces and places, and then we create programs that allow folks to come together and connect in healthy ways. We also need to make sure that social connectedness becomes a social norm, that it is a principle and community priority, that we can center our kind of as the hub of the work that we do within our communities. All of these things require policies that center and prioritize social connectedness. This takes place at the local level. We're probably not going to see policies at the state level that are going to influence social connectedness in an effective way for everyone, because what works for social connectedness in an urban setting is not necessarily going to work to create social connectedness in a rural setting or in a tribal setting. And so what are ways that we can influence and impact policy at the local level to increase opportunities for social connectedness? within those communities and populations. And then finally, as we mentioned before, through that abundance thinking, we need to make sure that we shift power to community members. We've heard the term before, not for us, without us. If we're developing, if we have some great higher authority who's deciding what community members need to increase social connectedness, it's not going to be impactful. It is important to allow the members within that community to be able to take the lead on what those efforts are going to look like. So here are the 6 pillars of to advance social connection that were mentioned in the U.S. Surgeon General's advisory that was just released earlier this year. The first, and you'll notice that you'll see kind of where these sort of coincide with Healthy Places by Design's pillars. First is strengthen social infrastructure in local communities. That's kind of creating the spaces, the places, and funding programs and opportunities for connection to take place. That is done through pro-connection public policy. And so where are the policy levers within your communities? How can you leverage them to increase connectedness among the population you serve? The needs of the population that you serve are different than the general community. And so what are ways that you can within your organizations and within those groups that you are working with who have experienced crime, have been victims of crime and have gone through that personal trauma? How can you create policies and rules within your organizations to create connection and encourage pro-connection? Next is mobilizing the health sector, because as Nathan showed you, this is the new smoking. This is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it's not because just being socially isolated is making you unwell. It's that being socially isolated leads you to behaviors and choices that are damaging to your health. Maybe you're self-medicating with drugs or alcohol, and that's going to reduce your life expectancy. Maybe you're struggling with depression and anxiety, and that might increase your risk for early death through suicide. And so that is decreasing life expectancy. So it's very important for us to realize that this is a health issue, a health and social issue that we can come together across sectors to improve. Then there's reforming digital environments. You see a lot in the news right now about states kind of taking on the way that digital environments have influenced and impacted youth connectedness and feelings of social isolation and loneliness. And I think it's important to also notice that this happens within our homes and within our communities as well. As adults, are we modeling healthy social media use for our young people? Are we doing what we can to ensure that when we use social or digital environments that they're safe for us? And what can we do to ensure that they're safe for the young people that we interact with in our lives? And then we need to deepen our knowledge. This just basically means other states need to catch up with Utah in our data collection, because we're killing it. We're so much, I say that and I kind of joke, but really, as it goes across the nation, Utah really is kind of ahead of the curve when it comes to deepening our knowledge about what is happening as far as social isolation within our communities and what effective approaches might be to address those. And then again, it's that social norms change, cultivating a culture of connection within those communities and the populations that we serve. It's important to understand that it's more than just having a seat at the table when we're talking about making these changes. The Othering and Belonging Institute explains that belonging or being fully human means more than just having access. Belonging entails being respected at a basic level that includes the right to both co-create and make demands upon society. So when we're thinking about designing places and spaces for individuals who've experienced trauma and crime victimization to connect, we need to make sure that they have a say in the way that happens in the spaces that they occupy. So I'm just going to show you this quick video. I'm not sure whether or not the sound will play or not, but it really is just really, heartwarming music in the background. But I want you to see an example of how a community in Dallas leveraged kind of a community-based approach and took a lot within their community that had a really, really high crime rate and reimagined it and changed it so that it became a space for connection. I just love that little video because it just goes to show you how bringing together community members and grabbing a few buckets of paint and building a little makeshift stage where community performing can take place could take a space that was really high in crime and make it a space for connection. So an example of how placemaking can truly make a difference within the safety and wellness of our communities. I love this quote. It also comes from Vivek Murthy's book, but it says, call it a clan, call it a network, call it a tribe, call it a family, whatever you call it, whoever you are, you need one. You need one because you are human. We are not islands. We do need human connection in order to thrive, to be more resilient, to be more productive, to be more creative. We know that connectedness makes us healthy and whole and fulfilled as individuals and broader within our communities. And so this is why it needs to be so foundational to so much of the work that we do. And unfortunately has been overlooked up to this point, but we're hoping by going on kind of this, as Nathan and I are doing, having opportunities to present to different groups to help you realize how foundational social connectedness is to the success of the work that you're doing and improving the lives of those you serve. So I'm going to talk just really quickly about some of the things we're doing in the Violence and Injury Prevention Program to improve social connectedness. You're going to see several QR codes to this end, but this first one is just a link to VIPP's strategic framework, kind of showing not just our community connectedness strategic priorities, but across the board on our approaches to decrease violence and injury. And then other work that we've done is we've created this Youth Connectedness Toolkit. And the Youth Connectedness Toolkit employs a shared risk and protector factor approach to improve health across the lifespan for young people. The Connectedness Toolkit includes recommendations for parents and caregivers, for schools, including students and staff. It provides recommendations for centering connectedness in policymaking, in law enforcement, and creating connectedness through community policing through law enforcement efforts. It provides recommendations for connection in the faith setting and then across the broader community as well. In addition to this, though, it doesn't just jump directly into recommendations. It also educates on the different social, emotional, and cognitive stages of development for young people. Social connectedness starts early and often. And so we don't just start with those stages for teens, but also include an appendix with information on that across from the time of birth and through the teen years. It also helps caregivers understand and apply reasonable expectations based on each of those stages, because we find that especially with child maltreatment, sometimes those expectations that we have as parents don't really match where our child's cognitive or emotional development is at that point. And so understanding the way that child's brains and bodies change over that time can help us improve our connection with them. It also includes data, some of that Nathan showed today, but some even more, so we can kind of identify the areas where we're doing well and which areas we need to improve in order to improve connectedness for our youth. And finally, it applies a two-generation approach to healthy connection, because we know we cannot raise healthy, safe, connected kids if we do not have healthy, safe, connected parents and caregivers. And so it's really important for us to acknowledge, how are you doing? Are you finding opportunities to connect? Here are some suggestions on where you may find social connection and how you can model healthy connection for your kids. Additionally, we're in the process, a long process. We've been creating what has been named the Together Utah campaign due to COVID and the merger of Health and Human Services and some funding issues and staffing issues. This has been a little slow to roll out, but the Together Utah campaign is a strength-based public awareness effort to increase protective factors and positive childhood experiences, but not just positive childhood experiences, encouraging positive adult experiences too, ways that we can create connection across the lifespan. It also tries to focus in on reducing stigma associated with help seeking, because we all know that asking for help is healthy, but it's so darn hard to do. And so what can we do to kind of decrease the stigma around asking for help, whether it be concrete things like, you know, addressing food insecurity or housing instability, or just more those emotional social safety nets that are important to ensure that we have health and safety across the lifespan. And then finally, it connects Utahns to community resources that are available within their communities to because connection isn't just about that warm, fuzzy feeling. It's if you're socially isolated, you're also disconnected from community resources. And so we want to make sure that when we think about connection, we think about it both as that internal need that we have to have that social safety net, but also access to available resources that will ensure health and safety for us and for our families. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Professor Julianne Holt-Lundstadt's work, the meta-analysis that was done and kind of the approaches across the nation and internationally, what's being done to address social isolation, you can go to our website and click on this link, and it'll take you to an ACES Learning Collaborative that we did earlier this year, focused on social connection. And that link, there will be a QR code on the last slide that will take you to our website, and you can see our entire strategic plan for reducing child maltreatment and ensuring safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments for Utah kids, as well as all of our deliverables, which include our ACES Learning Collaborative recordings and the Youth Connectedness Toolkit. So today, I hope some of the key points that we take away from this conversation is that social connection truly does improve outcomes for us at the individual level and across the entire socio-ecological model. Individual level, our interpersonal relationship level, across our communities and across society as a whole. I hope that you've also, can acknowledge that trauma and healing don't happen in isolation. They happen within the context of community. And so in order to ensure better outcomes for those who've experienced trauma and to enable effective healing, we need to make sure that we're leveraging community connectedness and increasing connectedness within our communities and schools and churches and homes. And then finally, we can improve community connectedness through community design, changing social norms that promote violence, and by addressing systemic injustices. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and speak to you today. This QR code will take you to our website where you'll see our entire strategic plan for prevention of adverse childhood experiences and child maltreatment, and all of the deliverables, as I mentioned before. And if you're interested in connecting further, here's our information. But I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions. So if there are any questions, please feel free to come off mute, and we'd be happy to answer.
Have any questions in the room? Do you see me in the chat? Okay.
Hey.
Thank you so much, Joey and Nathan. Such good information. And definitely I appreciate the QR codes for more information. I didn't want to miss someone if they had a question in the chat, sorry.
No, everyone should say thank you so much. That was supposed to be
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Such great information. I really appreciate your guys' time. And their presentation is in the handouts and resources. So